Welcome to This Week Explained, the podcast that helps you make sense of the complexities of our ever-changing world. I'm Tiana, and each week, alongside my co-host Kervin, we break down the biggest global events and explain how they might impact you. This week, we're covering the ongoing wars in Ukraine and the Middle East, and Indonesia's inclusion in the BRICS organization. We also have two updates for you. ISIS has responded to the New Orleans attack through their weekly newsletter, and there's also an update on the situation in Syria. There is a lot to unpack, so let's get right into it. I want to start with the latest developments in the Russia-Ukraine war. So let's start with the big headline, Donald Trump's recent comments about NATO and Ukraine. What the heck is going on there?
Well, look, President-elect Donald Trump made huge waves this week. He kind of expressed sympathy for Russia's position on Ukraine and NATO, and he essentially said that Russia has long opposed Ukraine joining NATO, which is actually very true. But he also said he understands Russia's concerns. Now, Trump even went as far as to say that this opposition is, quote unquote, written in stone. And he criticized the Biden administration for supporting Ukraine's NATO aspirations.
That's a pretty bold statement, especially considering where the majority of the United States citizens stand on this conflict. So what is the significance of this, especially in the context of the war?
Look, it's significant because it highlights a potential shift in U.S. foreign policy. Now, Trump and his allies argue that Ukraine's NATO membership would provoke Moscow and kind of risk dragging the alliance into a broader war. Now, on the flip side, Ukraine views NATO membership as a vital shield against Russian aggression. There is some middle ground to consider, though. And let's be honest, if you strip away the Russian invasions, Ukraine probably wouldn't even meet the bar for NATO membership. And that's not my opinion. That's just a fact. The country has struggled with widespread corruption for decades. It's swung back and forth between Western-backed and Russian-backed governments. Corruption is deeply ingrained in the system in Ukraine. Now, Zelensky has made efforts to clean that up, but let's face it, it's still a persistent issue.
All right. So if Ukraine's NATO membership isn't realistic due to corruption and other internal challenges, but they see it as essential for deterring Russian aggression, what does the middle ground actually look like? And is there a realistic alternative that provides Ukraine with the security guarantees they need without full NATO membership? And promise, this is the last question. And how does the West balance supporting Ukraine while addressing these long-standing issues of corruption?
Yeah, look, well, the first thing is there's another option. It's not just NATO. There's the European Union option. Now, that's going to still irritate Putin, but EU membership is less of a direct military threat to Russia than NATO is. Now, for Ukraine, it's a win. It solidifies their alignment with the West, and it provides economic and political stability for that country. So, back to the Russia side, this is a compromise, and it's a compromise that they might tolerate in the ongoing peace negotiations, which I will say Trump moved from day one, 24 hours from when he's in office to the first 100 days of his office. So we've kind of discussed that, Tiana, where...
Oh, he's not saying he can end it right whenever he steps into office. It will take up to 100 days for him to reach an agreement. Okay.
Yeah, and we do that. We discussed it on this podcast for the election conversation.
Right.
Now, if NATO membership is off the table, Europe could step up. Now, that's even if NATO and EU membership is off the table. Europe could step up with a collective security framework that is specifically for Ukraine. So think of this as a European-led version of NATO's Article 5. We know Article 5 means if one country is attacked, all the countries come to their defense. That would commit to military intervention if Russia invades again. This would give Ukraine the protection it needs without crossing Russia's red line. Now, let's be clear. Europe needs to take responsibility. This war is on their continent. It affects them more than anyone else. So far, the U.S. has carried much of the burden in this war, but Europe needs to pay their fair share. So whether that's through increased defense spending, more military aid, or leading the charge on security guarantees, they need to come to the table.
I want to get into this news of the Biden administration about a final weapons package for Ukraine. What do we know about that?
Yeah, that's right. So Joe Biden is transitioning out of the White House as President-elect Donald Trump transitions in, and they are now preparing to announce what they're calling a substantial final weapons package for Ukraine. The Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin is expected to reveal the details during a meeting in Germany soon. That meeting is going to be with representatives from about 50 allied nations. Now, we don't know the exact value yet of this final weapons package, but we know it's not going to exhaust the remaining $4 billion in U.S. funding for Ukraine. So you can kind of see the figure where the figures might align in that.
So you're saying it'll be less than $4 billion, probably?
Yeah, it'll be less. I caution to say significantly less because, what is significant when you're talking $4 billion?
Right. Okay, so why is this being called the final package? Do you think whenever Trump steps into office, the U.S. will pull back its support?
Look, not exactly. I haven't made that assessment yet. And the term final likely refers to the fact that this is the last major aid package before President Biden leaves office. So final meaning President Biden's final aid package. And the administration is trying to deliver as much military assistance as possible while they're still in office. So it's worth noting that U.S. officials say 80 to 90% of all promised stockpile equipment has already been delivered to Ukraine before Trump enters office.
So this is about timing and ensuring Ukraine has what it needs before these changes in U.S. leadership, correct?
Yeah, exactly. So the Biden administration is racing against the clock, especially with the results of the 2024 election, which handed not just Donald Trump the White House, but Republicans full control of the U.S. government.
Okay, well, I know some people are thrilled about that, but I can't say that I'm one of them. But okay,
I mean, you knew. I can go on the record here. We don't really talk about politics, but as the 2020 election was coming up and as this 2024 election was coming up, I think we both were standing firm in that whoever wins the presidency, I hope the other party wins either the House or the Senate.
Yeah.
They do those checks and balances.
Yes.
A lot of people think, well, nothing's going to get done. And it's like, that's the point, guys. I don't want a lot to get done because the wrong things are getting done in D.C. So,
all right. Well,
it's not just about Trump. It's not just about Republicans or Democrats. It's about checks and balances. And I think we need that in this government.
Which we aren't going to have for the next 4 years, it looks like.
We're going to see how.
Okay. Yeah, let's not go down that road. We don't know what's going to happen. You're right. Mm-hmm. We do not know what's going to happen. So let's shift to the battlefield instead. There's been a lot of talk about intensified fighting in the Kursk region. Can you tell us what's going on there?
Yeah, look, Ukraine did another counteroffensive in the Kursk region, and the fighting has definitely escalated. So Ukraine's general staff reported at least 94 clashes just this week. That's double the number. So that was on a Tuesday. That was double the number that they had on the Monday, and it just keeps increasing throughout this week. Now, Russia claims that it defeated the Ukrainian brigades in 6 locations, and they actually said they launched strikes in 7 other locations. Meanwhile, Ukraine launched a new offensive in the region, but they've been kind of tight-lipped about the details and objectives of that new offensive.
Well, it sounds like even with the winter months upon us, the situation on the ground is intensifying, which that's not usually what happens. Usually things start winding down for winter because, the ground is frozen solid and things are muddy and, all that stuff. So what does this mean for the broader conflict?
You're absolutely right. It's usually, no fighting going on. And we are still stuck in a stalemate. I like to use the word stuck there for the winter months because that is usually what's happening. But like you said, usually they're not doing much. Now they're escalating. Why is that? It's a race against the clock before before his inauguration. And remember last week we kind of joked that America's standing in the world has taken a hit, and we were like, yeah, it's taken a hit for a while and laughed about it. But here's the thing. We might have laughed about that. But this situation proves that the world still looks to the United States, even with a Trump presidency, as the primary peacemaker in these global conflicts. Like it or not, that's the role the United States plays.
I don't think it's the Trump presidency that necessarily made our reputation take a hit. I think.
No, that's not. Oh, I'm sorry. And that's not what I'm. That wasn't what I was trying to say. Thank you for allowing some clarification there.
Okay.
Look, it has taken a hit for a while. We said it last week, and I was like, look, I've seen it happen because I've gone overseas quite a few times and have seen this gradual evolution of, oh, you're an American. Cool. I want to be next to you, to you're an American. Oh, my goodness. What are you doing here? You probably shouldn't be over here in this country. That's not a Trump thing. That is just things that are happening in this country that other countries don't understand, and they're trying to make sense of it, and they're not comfortable with what's happening.
Yeah. So now I want to talk about Russia's use of energy as a weapon. So what is happening with Moldova and Ukraine?
So it's interesting because Russia's Gazprom cut off heating and hot water in Moldova's Transnistria region. Now, if everybody remembers, that is that little enclave in Moldova that is controlled by a pro-Russian government and Russian forces. The little sliver of Russia in between, between the borders there with Moldova. And so they don't have gas and heating and hot water anymore. And it's leaving residents there to rely on wood and electric heaters. And at the same time, a gas transit agreement between Russia and Ukraine wasn't renewed by the start of the year, and that is further straining energy supplies in the region.
But if Transnistria is controlled by a Russian-leaning government, why did they cut off the heating and water there? Why did Russia cut it off? It doesn't make sense.
Excellent question, because if you're going to start a revolution in order to, at some point, take over Moldova, you've got to have the people rise up. And what Russia is doing right now is saying, Ukraine did this. Moldova did this. We have no control over it. We would love to give you this, all of the gas and, natural gas and oil and everything you need to heat your home and your water and all your resources. But we can't, because this Ukrainian deal we had lapsed in 2025. So it's the West's fault, not Russia's fault.
Oh, okay. So how is the EU responding to this?
Well, look, they're accusing Russia of weaponizing its gas export. The EU is doubling down on their solidarity with Moldova, and Brussels is working to help Moldova cut its dependence on Russian energy. Let's not sugarcoat it, though. The situation there is very grim. Russia's energy playbook is all about squeezing Ukraine and its neighbors, and it's also a stark reminder of just how tightly energy, economies, all this stuff, and geopolitics are intertwined together.
Well, before we wrap this portion of the podcast up, let's touch on diplomacy. There was supposed to be a visit to Kyiv by Trump's special envoy, Keith Kellogg, but it's been rescheduled. So what's the story there?
Yeah, look, Ukraine's foreign minister, Andrei Sybiha, announced that the visit's going to happen, but it's going to happen in its own time. And he emphasized that both sides are in contact to ensure that the meeting is as meaningful as it possibly can be. It is a delay, I can say that, but it doesn't seem to signal like a major issue in the relationship between Ukraine and Trump's team. And Kellogg also came out. He was the one that came out and said, this is going to take 100 days. It's not going to be 24 hours. And I think that gave the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian government more insight into it. This isn't going to be something where we're forced to agree with Russian demands. We do have a seat at the table, and there could be some compromise here. Good news there.
So it's more about timing and logistics than anything else?
Yeah, that's what it is. But it also does highlight the challenges of maintaining diplomatic momentum in the middle of a war. That's tough to do, especially with the kind of stalemate that's going on. It's also a reminder that U.S. engagement in the region could look very different once Trump does take office.
Moving on from the war in Ukraine, let's get into the Middle East conflict and discuss the ongoing hostage negotiations between Hamas and Israel, as well as the broader implications for the Gaza conflict. There's been a significant development. Hamas has named 34 Israeli hostages it is willing to release in exchange for concessions from Israel. So please, can you break this down for us?
Yeah, absolutely. Like you said, Hamas offered to release 34 hostages. That includes 2 dual U.S.-Israeli citizens, and that's all part of a potential ceasefire deal. We're getting very close, guys. We're getting very close to at least an 18-month ceasefire, which would do a lot for everybody, Israelis, Gazans, the whole Middle East. And the list includes 5 female soldiers, 5 civilian women, 2 infants, and then 22 other men. Now, there is a grim reality here. Some of these hostages may no longer be alive. From my sources that I have, there are only 20 live hostages left from the October 7th, 2023 attack. The rest of the live hostages are female soldiers that were taken as the war has raged over the last year.
Well, that's absolutely heartbreaking. What are Hamas's demands in exchange for the release of these hostages? Are they pushing for a full ceasefire, prisoner swaps, or something else entirely? And given the grim reality that some of these hostages may no longer be alive, how is this impacting the negotiations and the strategy on both sides?
Look, in exchange, Hamas is demanding the release of an unspecified number of Palestinian prisoners. And then they also want a partial withdrawal of Israeli troops from parts of Gaza. Now, this framework has reportedly been agreed to by Israel, but there are still significant hurdles to overcome.
That's wild that they think they can demand such a thing.
Let's not forget who started this.
No,
No, I know. That's what I'm saying. That's what you're alluding to. How can they demand this stuff when you started it?
Yeah. Anyway.
The hostages, you being Hamas, not Tiana. I'm sure everybody knows that. I did need to clarify that.
So if this deal goes through, it would only cover a fraction of the remaining hostages, correct?
Yep, that's right. I think people see, hey, we got a ceasefire deal, hostages are released, and that it covers all of the hostages, but Hamas needs the hostages for future leverage. There are still about 100 hostages in Gaza, and this deal would only secure the release of 34 of them. Notably, young male soldiers, including another dual U.S.-Israeli citizen named Eden Alexander, would still remain in captivity.
Wait a second. Why is there so much discussion about who gets released and who doesn't?
Yeah, that's a very fair question. And I know it's frustrating for everybody to watch, but the truth is that this is all just a high-stakes game of cat and mouse between these negotiators. So the governments on both sides aren't operating with like the individual lives as their top priority. That's what we keep telling people. I say they don't care about you. And that's not entirely true. That's kind of hyperbole. But on an individual level, they probably don't care what's happening to you. They're playing for power, leverage, and the survival of millions, if not billions, of people under their watch. They've got to deal with all of that. That means not everyone's going to get a fair shake in this idea of some kumbaya moment between the two negotiators where everyone's just going to shake hands and walk away. Unfortunately, that's a pipe dream in a situation like the one we have now.
Okay, I get that this deal is far from comprehensive for various reasons. So then what's holding up a broader agreement?
Yeah, great question. There's several sticking points here. Hamas, they're demanding a clear timetable to end the war. They want Israeli troops to withdraw, and they even want a commitment to a multi-year ceasefire. I think right now they're at 18 months, but they want more than that. They want 2 to 4 years. On the other hand, Israel is unwilling to halt its military offensive in Gaza. That means they are not going to compromise with Hamas there. And they're definitely not going to halt the military offensive without a full release of every single hostage that Hamas owns.
I can only imagine how difficult this has to be for the families of the hostages who are just kind of left in limbo while the governments use their loved ones as pawns.
Yep, and that's always why I'm glad you're here on the podcast, because you're the voice for that, and we should not forget that fact. These are real people that we are talking about. And both the hostages and the Gazans who have lost everything are true, real people. This is an umbrella group representing the families. They're called the Hostages and Missing Families Forum. They've expressed deep distress over this list that keeps coming out of who's going to get released and who's not. And they're particularly upset because it excludes the names of other hostages who are actually still believed to be alive, meaning Hamas is trying to hand over hostages that are not alive over in prioritization of hostages that are still alive because that's more leverage. So they're all calling for a comprehensive deal to release all hostages, not just a select few.
Well, it sounds like emotions are running high on both sides. So are there any signs of flexibility in the negotiations?
Interestingly enough, there is some flexibility. Both Israeli and Hamas officials signaled this willingness to negotiate the identity and number of Palestinian prisoners to be released in exchange for the hostages. So typically we'll see 10 Israeli hostages released and 100 Palestinian prisoners released. They're working on those two numbers right now. But the broader issues like ending the war and troop withdrawals, those remain significant obstacles.
And obviously, even with a potential deal, the war in Gaza is far from over.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Israel has made it clear that it will not agree to a permanent end to its military offensive until all hostages are released. And Hamas has stated it's not going to release all hostages without a guarantee that the war is going to end. So this is this tragic stalemate, and there's no easy solutions in there.
Thank you so much for that update. Up next, we're heading to New Orleans. Well, not literally, though we definitely wouldn't mind a trip back home, where we'll be breaking down the recent vehicle attack on Bourbon Street. The attack left 14 people dead and dozens more injured, a tragedy that has shaken the city to its core. But before we dive into the details and ISIS's response to the attack, we've got to take a quick ad break. Got to keep the lights on around here. So stick with us and we'll be right back. Welcome back, listeners. Let's dive into the recent and devastating vehicle attack on Bourbon Street in New Orleans. What's specifically chilling about this tragedy is ISIS's response, which has raised even more questions about their reach and influence. So, Kervin, let's break it down. What do we know so far about ISIS's involvement in this horrific act?
Yeah, well, this is a textbook example of how ISIS has adapted its strategy in this, what we call the post-caliphate era. Now, the attacker posted videos on Facebook pledging allegiance to ISIS, and his truck even carried an ISIS flag. Now, it was rolled up. There was some speculation that police had rolled it up because of, deep state, PSYOP, conspiracy theory things. But as I said, if you're driving from Houston to New Orleans and you're flying an ISIS flag unraveled, you'll probably get shot. And that's not an opinion from someone who's taken that drive. That's a fact.
Yeah, for real.
Now, while ISIS didn't claim direct responsibility for orchestrating this attack, they were quick to highlight it in their Al-Naba newsletter. They've essentially taken credit for inspiring Jabbar through their own propaganda.
So they're not saying they planned the attack, but they are still claiming it as a victory.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right. This is a key part of ISIS's current strategy. Their physical caliphate has been dismantled, but their propaganda machine is alive and well. And they've shifted their focus to inspiring lone actor attacks, which these are low cost, but they can have a devastating impact on not just the population in the attack, but the psychological effects that happen across the United States. Now, in this case, they actually praised Jabbar's actions as an example of how their messaging can influence individuals to carry out attacks on their own.
I think I remember in an earlier podcast episode, probably even a couple years ago, you said that ISIS was going to start transitioning to lone wolf attacks instead of these massive undertakings. Obviously, this whole thing is terrifying. So what did ISIS actually say about the attack in their newsletter?
Yeah, that'd be something I should probably go back and see if I can find when I said that. But yeah, that has been my assessment for a while now. According to a translation of the Al-Naba newsletter provided to us by the Counter-Extremism Project, and just to be clear, because I think everybody listening kind of knows I'm an Arabic linguist or a former Arabic linguist in the U.S. Army. My Arabic is not what it used to be. So I have to rely on these translations and then kind of piece it together for the tone, but I digress on that. Now, the newsletter emphasized that Jabbar had been influenced by their propaganda, and they even praised the low cost of the operation compared to the high number of casualties that he inflicted. What's even more disturbing is that they criticized Jabbar for not using those meta glasses, which investigators say that he was wearing, to broadcast the attack live. They really wish that he would have done that because of that psychological effect we all would have had. It's chilling to see how they're not just encouraging these attacks to happen, but they're actively analyzing them to refine future tactics.
So how does this fit into their propaganda strategy?
Well, look, it fits perfectly. ISIS has built this sophisticated media operation that includes English language propaganda that's specifically designed to reach Western audiences. They also have an Arab media propaganda machine for their Middle Eastern audiences. And they use this content to radicalize individuals and encourage them to carry out attacks in their home countries. The goal is to create chaos and fear without the need for this direct involvement that ISIS used to have. Now, Jabbar's attack is a tragic example of how effective all of these strategies can be.
And this isn't the first time we've seen ISIS call for vehicle attacks, is it?
No, not at all. Vehicle attacks have actually been the staple of their playbook for years. They've repeatedly called for these types of attacks in their propaganda, and they're appealing because they're easy to execute and difficult to prevent. The FBI has warned that lone actor attacks like this are one of the greatest domestic terror threats that we face in the United States today.
So why are these lone actor attacks so difficult to stop?
Well, look, the main challenge is that these individuals often operate in isolation. They don't have direct ties to terrorist organizations. That makes them incredibly difficult to identify. It also makes it very difficult to monitor these people. Now, in Jabbar's case, his radicalization appears to have happened entirely online. Now, without traditional networks or communication channels to track, law enforcement and intelligence agencies, they're just left trying to piece all of these clues together after the fact.
Well, it's clear that ISIS's propaganda network is still a major threat, even without a physical caliphate. So what can be done to counter it?
Well, we got to get our heads out of the sand. This is happening. I don't know why there's a ton of conversation about, oh my goodness, you're saying that Al-Qaeda and ISIS have operatives in the United States? That's happened for decades. That's happened across multiple administrations in the United States. But countering their propaganda requires a multi-pronged approach. Governments and private tech companies need to work together to identify and remove extremist content from these online platforms. But this is one of the pitfalls of a free society with freedom to say whatever you want. Sometimes the words that people can say freely can radicalize individuals. So the U.S. is also going to need to invest in counter-messaging campaigns that challenge ISIS narratives and then offer alternative paths for individuals who might be vulnerable to radicalization. And there's also the other point of addressing the root causes of radicalization, like social isolation. That's to include staying on social media and your only friends are on social media and you're holed up in your room all the time. That causes mental health issues, and it can also kind of lead to economic disenfranchisement. We also see that with medical bills. All of these things that Americans are struggling with every single day. That's what we saw with Jabbar. He was having all of these struggles, and it radicalized him against the United States. All of these things are critical for the U.S. to prevent these kind of future attacks.
Thank you so much for that update. Now let's shift our focus to Syria, where the new government is already shaking up the regional and international landscape. We've previously unpacked Shara's controversial history and his connections to HTS. So we'll skip the backstory for now, unless our listeners want us to dive deeper into it next episode. Please let us know. Yep. Today, we are zeroing in on the global response to his leadership, Israel's growing unease, and the broader implications for the Middle East. Kervin, bring us up to speed here. How is the world reacting to this dramatic shift in Syria's power dynamics?
Well, look, the international response has been a mix of cautious engagement and then outright skepticism. So on one hand, Western countries like France and Germany have sent their senior diplomats over to Damascus for discussions, and they're urging Sharia to ensure a peaceful and inclusive transition of power. They've emphasized the need for political dialogue that includes all ethnic and religious groups. Now, the European Union has signaled a willingness to support Syria's transition, but there's a clear warning there. They are not going to finance any Islamist structures.
So they're clearly walking a tightrope here, engaging with Sharia just enough to keep the lines of communication open, but still keeping him at arm's length. So what's the strategy behind this balancing act? Is it about hedging their bets, testing his legitimacy, or simply avoiding the appearance of fully backing a leader who might not have staying power? What's really driving this cautious approach?
Well, look, it's all about stability, Tiana. After more than a decade of civil war, millions of Syrians have fled the country. This created a massive refugee crisis all across the globe. European countries in particular are eager to see those refugees return to Syria. So, supporting Sharia's government, even cautiously, is seen as a way to stabilize Syria and then facilitate that process to move the refugees back home. There's a lot of hesitation. And that's because of Sharia's past and the Islamist roots of his government.
And what about the Arab world? Are they taking a similar approach?
Not exactly. The Arab countries have been much quicker to engage with Sharia. You had Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar. They've all sent diplomats to Damascus, and they've expressed support for Syria's reconstruction, as well as a peaceful transition. Now, they're framing this as an opportunity to bring Syria back into the Arab fold after years of isolation under the Assad regime. Look, take Europe and the Middle East, all that away. We even have Ukraine jumping into this. They have sent humanitarian aid, and they've also signaled a willingness to help stabilize that country while their country goes through a devastating war.
I was about to say they might want to focus on stabilizing their own country first before they
Sounds like
start
America,
offering.
right?
Okay, so let's shift to Israel, which seems to be taking a much harder line with Sharia, which is not surprising because that's what they do. They take hard lines. Mm-hmm. What is their official position?
Well, look, they're deeply skeptical, to say the least. So they see this government as a rebranded jihadist regime, and they're warning their allies not to fall for the new image he's trying to project. Foreign Minister Gideon Saar has been particularly vocal. He's argued that Sharia's government poses a threat to minorities like the Alawites, the Kurds, even Christians, and it could destabilize the region. And he's also concerned that European countries are way too eager to legitimize this new government in their rush to send all the refugees back to Syria.
And what about Israel's security concerns? How does Sharia's rise impact that?
Yeah, Israel's main concern is the Iranian influence and then the weapons transfers that flow through Syria into Lebanon to Hezbollah. A destabilized Middle East will affect Israel's security more than anyone else in the world. And Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has made it clear that if Sharia's government allows Iran to reestablish itself in Syria or facilitates the transfer of those weapons, Israel's going to respond forcefully. They had Defense Minister Israel Katz warned that despite Sharia's moderate rhetoric, his government still has ties to extreme Islamist ideologies.
Okay, well, I'm glad you mentioned that because interestingly enough, Sharia has been making some surprising overtures toward peace with Israel. So what exactly has he been saying?
Yeah, he's really been very deliberate in his messaging. He's stated that his government is committed to the 1974 disengagement agreement with Israel. And he's also said he doesn't want conflict with Israel. He has said that Syria's not going to be used as a launch pad for attacks on Israel. That's a direct slap in the face to Iran. Now, other Syrian officials have echoed these statements and similar statements, and it's all coming together to emphasize this, what is perceived to be a desire for peace and coexistence.
That's a surprising shift. I really don't think Israel is buying it based on what they've been saying, though.
Yeah, you'd be correct. They're not buying this. And honestly, why would they buy it? Let's flash back to 2011. The media practically threw a ticker-tape parade for Hamas when they signed a deal with the Palestinian Authority. Hamas promised the world they had turned over a new leaf. We are embracing non-violence. Now let's fast forward to October 7th, 2023. That promise was exposed for what it really was. It was a lie. This isn't breaking news on this podcast. Israel is surrounded by adversaries who openly call for its annihilation. So while Israel has signaled a cautious willingness to maintain correct ties with the new regime, they're not about to let their guard down. And frankly, I don't blame them.
So let's zoom out for a moment. What does all of this mean for the region as a whole? Is Shara's rise a turning point for Syria and its neighbors, or do you think it's just going to be the same old, same old?
Well, look, it could be a turning point, a new regime, a better regime, but it's way too early to tell. So on one hand, we've got his government, which represents a break from the Assad era. And so there's potential for more stability in Syria. Now, on the other hand, he's got those Islamist roots and a controversial past, which make him a polarizing figure. If he can deliver on his promises of peace and coexistence, that's going to be a game changer for the region. However, if he reverts to his old ways, or if he allows Iran to gain a foothold in Syria, it could lead to more instability. I mean, look, we just watched that Clint Eastwood movie, Juror Number 2. That whole movie is about whether people can truly change. And we didn't even get a clear answer to that at the end. No spoilers here. So when it comes to this situation, we're about to find out, can someone truly change?
And not have to face consequences for their prior actions. That was part of it. Okay, so.
It was great. Go watch it.
Yeah. So what about the refugee crisis? Could Shara's government really pave the way for millions of Syrians to finally return to their homeland?
Yeah, that's the hope, especially for European countries. It's not just about stability, though. It's also about trust. So the refugees need to feel safe returning to Syria. Let's not gloss over the fact that they spent years under the thumb of a brutal regime in the Assad regime. There's trust issues there. They feel safe returning. That's going to be a good thing. But it's all going to depend on how Shara governs in the coming months. So if he can create an inclusive and peaceful environment, that's going to encourage people to come back to Syria. Yet if his government is seen as oppressive or unstable, especially in those early months, the refugee crisis is going to continue, especially on the European continent.
So, Kervin, what is your bottom line on all of this? Is Shara's government a step forward for Syria, or is it just a new face on an old problem?
Yeah, I think it's my assessment is a little bit of both. His rise definitely marks a shift in Syria's political landscape. And look, sure, there's potential for progress, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. He has a past, and his past, combined with the Islamist roots of his government, those are flashing these neon red signs. Red flags, sorry. Look, it's going to take time. It's probably going to take not months, but a few years to gain that trust back. And we can truly gauge whether this is a genuine step forward or just more of the same under a different name. And look, we haven't even been able to talk about the other power players in the mix. There's Turkey, the United States, we got the Kurds, Russia. They all have their own agendas, and none of them are just going to sit back and let Shara reshape Syria without a fight. So there is potential here. We could have something good brewing here, but the road ahead is anything but straightforward.
I think you're right, because if you experience decades and decades of trauma, it's not all going to be wiped out with a couple months of, hand-holding. And well, I think this is a good spot to shift our focus to the final portion of this episode of the podcast. So let's get into Indonesia's formal entry into BRICS, the group that is being called the Global South. This is a huge development, and it's been making waves in the geopolitical world. So, Kervin, can you start by explaining what BRICS is for our newer listeners and why Indonesia's membership is so significant?
Yeah, absolutely. And like Tiana said, if you're just tuning in just now, I don't think since I went on Mike Baker's podcast, we really talked about BRICS. So we might have some new listeners. Maybe they don't know what BRICS is, and there's a lot of people that don't. BRICS stands for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. It's a block of heavyweight emerging economies that have come together to shake up the global order. Now, originally, the goal was to promote economic cooperation and then challenge the dominance of Western-led institutions like the IMF and the World Bank. But over time, BRICS has evolved into a platform for pushing reforms in global governance and strengthening alliances among these developing nations. Now, Indonesia joining the club is a big deal. We're talking about the world's fourth most populous country and a major player in Southeast Asia. Its membership doesn't just add another seat at the table, it expands BRICS' geographic reach, and it boosts its clout in what you mentioned is this term, the Global South. And the Global South, for anybody who doesn't know what that is, this is this catch-all term for the emerging economies and developing nations across Africa, Asia, and Latin America.
Well, thank you for that great overview. Now, I understand that Indonesia has been interested in joining BRICS for some time. So what motivated them to take this step right now?
Yeah, you're right. Indonesia has long seen BRICS as a strategic platform to strengthen collaboration with these other developing nations, as well as advance the interests of the Global South. Now, the country's foreign ministry stated that BRICS membership is a way to increase partnerships and cooperations with emerging economies. However, the timing of their formal request is interesting. Indonesia's bid was actually approved by BRICS during the 2023 summit in Johannesburg. That might have been the last time we really talked about BRICS. But they chose to wait until after their presidential election to finalize their membership. It seems the new administration wanted to ensure a smooth transition before committing to such a major geopolitical move.
That makes a lot of sense. And honestly, I wish more governments would operate that way. It feels like too many leaders today are more focused on pushing their own agendas to cement some kind of legacy rather than making decisions that actually serve their people in the long run. So, what does Indonesia bring to the table as a BRICS member, and how does this align with the bloc's goals?
They make a ton of good points there with governments and individuals in power who want to solidify their legacy and not worry about the people within their borders. But getting back to Indonesia, they bring a lot to the table. They're not just showing up to BRICS with a plate asking for handouts. They are Southeast Asia's largest economy. They're packed with natural resources, and they have a booming economic market. This is a heavyweight addition to the bloc. Some have even called it, because we have BRICS Plus, right? We've talked about BRICS Plus. Some are saying they might just add an extra I to show how much Indonesia is a power in.
I was about to say, are we going to start calling it BRICS? It's going to have two eyes.
BRICS. I don't know what we do, but that is it's a powerful statement to put it as one of the acronyms and not just be a part of BRICS Plus. Indonesia is throwing its weight behind the push to shake up global governance like the UN, the World Bank. They are demanding a seat at the table for all of these developing, emerging economies. Let's be real. It's not about joining a club for Indonesia. This is about amplifying the voices of the Global South. Indonesia's vision of a tighter cooperation among emerging economies and challenging the Western-dominated systems aligns perfectly with BRICS' mission, especially Russia and China. So with Indonesia on board, we're not just seeing BRICS expand, it's solidifying its role as a global power player.
Speaking of expansion, BRICS has been growing recently. Can you tell us more about that and how Indonesia fits into this trend?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what I talked about, BRICS Plus, right? And said that was probably our last discussion on BRICS, that conference in the summit in Johannesburg. And so in addition to Indonesia, the bloc added Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, the UAE, the United Arab Emirates. Now, this expansion reflects BRICS' ambition to become a more inclusive and representative platform for developing nations. So Indonesia's entry fits perfectly into this trend. It's a major economy, and it complements the group's existing members and adds to its diversity. So if BRICS is going to add a new currency, they need Indonesia in there. So with countries from South America, Africa, the Middle East, and now Southeast Asia, BRICS is becoming a truly global coalition of emerging powers.
That's fascinating. But with all of these new members, do you think BRICS can maintain cohesion and effectively pursue its goals? Or do you think it's going to be too many cooks in the kitchen kind of thing?
That's the question, right? And you have a lot of, there's a lot to unpack here, and we just don't have enough time to get to it all. But I'll give my opinion here. I like to say when it's my opinion. So I am of the opinion that BRICS expansion is a net negative for global security. Expanding a bloc like BRICS does come with challenges. Each member has got its own unique interests and priorities, and that can sometimes lead to disagreements. Look, China and India have had their fair share of tensions, and so by adding more members, that could complicate the decision-making. Now, that said, there are other very highly respectable analysts that are cautiously optimistic about it. And that's because BRICS operates on a consensus-based model. And that means all members are going to need to agree on major decisions. Think of it like NATO as well. Everyone had to agree to bring Sweden and Finland in.
Except NATO's not very effective either sometimes.
Right. They've got their own problems. But if you're looking at it and you want to see what BRICS could be, look at NATO and what they're doing. And so NATO for the West, BRICS for the global South. That's what we've got here. And so with Indonesia's entry, the bloc gains a member that has a history of balancing relationships with major powers. That's a key plus for BRICS, and that could help bridge divides within that group.
Well, it sounds like Indonesia's membership could be a stabilizing force for BRICS. So before we wrap up, what should we be watching for as this development unfolds?
Yeah, I need to keep an eye on how Indonesia integrates into BRICS. I want to know what role it plays in shaping the bloc's agenda. We've also got to watch for any shifts in Indonesia's foreign policy as it deepens ties with BRICS members. Who are they aligning with? Finally, pay attention to how this expansion impacts the bloc's influence on global governance and its ability to challenge those Western-led institutions, one of which being NATO.
Thank you, Kervin. Is that all you have for us?
That is all I have, unless you have anything else you want to talk about.
No, I'm good. Thank you so much for listening to this tiny little independent geopolitical podcast. We hope you found it both informative and engaging. If you have any feedback or suggestions for future episodes, please let us know. And if you want in-depth coverage of these stories and more, follow us on Instagram at Oakwin Analytics.
Tiana, thank you so much. And until next week, stay safe out there.
This podcast is a production of Unfiltered Studios. If you would like to know more about joining Unfiltered Studios, please visit our website at unfpod.com for more information.